Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Portland's 1995-96 Science Technology Society Lectures. My name is Terry Bristol. I'm the president of the Institute for Science, Engineering, and Public Policy, which organizes this series. Tonight's presentation by mathematician Dr. Ralph Abraham is entitled Euclid's Voyage into Chaos. Before I introduce Maynard Orme from Oregon Public Broadcasting, I'd like to take a moment to thank the series co-sponsors: Oregon Public Broadcasting, the University of Portland, Oregon Episcopal School, where Dr. Abraham visited a couple days ago, Portland State University, the Time Critical Information Source DAT Services, Pacific University, CTR Business Systems, the Business Journal, the University of Oregon, Computer Bits Magazine, and the high-tech PR firm Wagner Edstrom. I'd also like to thank the Heathman Hotel for providing first-class rooms for all the presenters that come in to Portland while they're in Portland. The reception that follows for those of you with patron tickets will be held in the second floor foyer immediately following tonight's event. Let me take a second here to mention that next month, on Friday, March 1st, the next speaker in our series is Dr. Richard Leakey, internationally renowned in his first career as a paleoanthropologist. In recent years, he was celebrated for his role as the Minister of Wildlife in Kenya, celebrated for, among other things, implementing an aggressive strategy for saving Kenya's elephant population from sure extinction at the hands of unscrupulous ivory hunters. Richard Leakey, born and educated in Nairobi and son of the famous paleontologist parents Louis and Mary Leakey, has now become one of the leading thinkers and articulate voices in our struggle to find practical and sustainable solutions to living together with other species in our global environment. To hear what's happening on the leading edge of environmental thinking, you'll want to come to listen to Richard Leakey's presentation entitled The Sixth Extinction. That's Friday, March 1st here at Arlene Schnitzer Concert Hall. And there's this late-breaking thing which I'm going to mention, which is there's a little tiny note in your study guide that you may find, and it says Stephen Hawking. And indeed, Stephen Hawking is going to be here, at least so I'm told. He calls his own shots, but he said he'd come in April. And it's kind of outside the series. It's going to be a new big deal, and this is sort of a definite tentative date, Tuesday, April 16th. And you'll be hearing more about this. We've set it up, it's going to be at the Child Center on the University of Portland campus. It's out in North Portland there, pretty easy to get to. Tickets aren't available yet, but I think they're going to be available in about a week, like middle to end of next week, if you want to start nailing down best seats and all that sort of thing. We do have a block of tickets we're going to put on hold for people who are seasoned subscribers, and we're sending you out a letter, which you will get, which will say there's this block of really neat seats that you can have that we're holding for you guys, particularly because you've supported this series, and give you a little leg up on getting best seats and stuff. The title of his talk, I think, is Does God Play Dice? And this is the other aspect of this thing. We have a kind of a dual coming out here. One of the things that the Institute has been doing in the background, some of you already know about this, but Linus Pauling was a local boy. Linus Pauling, who earned 2 Nobel Prizes, one in chemistry and the Peace Prize, and also is probably even more famous in a lot of people's mind for his work in micronutrient research, particularly about vitamin C and so forth in his later life. He was born in actually what's now Lake Oswego, and spent some time in Condon, Oregon, and then moved. His father died unexpectedly when he was 9, and his mother and 2 sisters moved to Portland and bought a house which they ran as a rooming house, and the family lived there for about 20 years. And this house is on between 39th and 40th on Southeast Hawthorne. And some people at BPA, actually, that were doing some informal science education called us up and said, hey, this thing's going to be turned into a 7-Eleven if somebody doesn't buy it and do something. And so we started looking around, and a gentleman, some of you may know by the name of Doug Strain, who was the founder of Electroscientific Industries and a real amazing guy in Portland, raised a lot of money for OMSI and lots of other things, and has helped us out. Anyway, he said, let's do it, and he was a student of Pauling's at Caltech, and he's done a lot for Pauling down there, and Pauling went to Oregon State too, and all his Nobel Prizes and everything are down at Oregon State. He designated Oregon State as the place for all his papers, and so we're kind of hooking up with him. Anyway, I'm not going to go on about this, except that we bought the house and the one next to it, and we're going to develop it and renovate it and turn it into a kind of a Linus Pauling museum. We figure Linus Pauling was Oregon's boy, and he's a great role model for science and for not only as a great scientist, but for the scientist with a larger vision of the world and our place in it. Anyway, so I won't go on, but that's what this is all about. Thanks. So, and I'll just say one last thing. We did something with Stephen Hawking, and we've done a couple of things with him before, and Stephen and I get along pretty well. And I had a chance to talk to him in Aspen, Colorado this summer, and I told him about the Pauling idea and the project, and he has this amplifier on his thing, and he just gave this big yes, So I said, would you come and be the first Linus Pauling lecturer? And he said, yes, I will. And it's a great idea. So anyway, Stephen Hawking will be here April 16th as the first Linus Pauling lecturer, and you'll hear more about this, but that's the early word for you that are here tonight. So back to tonight's presentation. Dr. Abraham will entertain questions at the end of the formal presentation. There are 3 mics as usual, 1, 2, and 1 up there. There are also questions, and I'll sort of act as the 4th microphone. So the questions come up, I'll sort them, and we'll rotate as we did last time for you as you were here. The formal presentation tonight will take a little better than an hour, and the dialogue part will be roughly 45 minutes, so we're going to try and end between 9:30 and 10. So we'll try and keep to that schedule. It's now my pleasure to introduce Maynard Orme, President and CEO of Oregon Public Broadcasting, who will introduce Dr. Ralph Abraham.
Thank you all very much for coming tonight in this strange and chaotic week in Oregon. Quite appropriate for Dr. Abraham's talk, I think. He's been described as perhaps the most readable and delightful of the modern mathematical pioneers. Dr. Abraham has taught at Columbia and Princeton and is currently Professor Emeritus of Mathematics at the University of California at Berkeley. He's been a pioneer of chaos theory and its applications and founded a graduate program of computational mathematics at the University of California in Santa Cruz. In the great tradition of Henry Poincaré and Alfred North Whitehead, Dr. Abraham has shown himself to be a true mathematical humanist. He has written extensively on the cultural history of mathematics and chaos theory. He is the author or co-author of 5 texts of advanced mathematics, and his most recent and heralded popular writings include Chaos, Gaia, and Eros, and the Web Empowerment book, one I think I need to read, a work devoted entirely to the prospective home users of the internet. In Chaos, Gaia, and Eros, Dr. Abraham makes the case that the chaos revolution of our own times belongs on a long list of shortwave crises such as the Renaissance. But even more, he feels that this chaos revolution belongs on a shorter list of long-wave crises with, for instance, 2 of the largest social transformations of the past several millennia, the agricultural revolution around 10,000 BC and the invention of the wheel and writing around 4,000 BC. Dr. Abraham's current work in progress, entitled Euclid's Voyage into Chaos, presents a provocative analysis of this chaos transformation as it has occurred during the last century. That is, the transformation from ancient Euclidean to modern chaotic and fractal geometry. Tonight in his presentation, Dr. Abraham will share with us the core themes of his work in progress. He will help us understand the emergence and large-scale practical significance of the new post-Euclidean mathematics, chaos theory, fractal geometry, and fuzzy logic, something that I can relate to. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in bringing to Oregon and giving a warm Portland welcome to Dr. Ralph Abraham.
Must be static in that pocket. I've looked forward for a long time to a visit to Portland, and it just happened to coincide with the great flood of '96. So last year at this time, I was in the great quake of Kobe in Japan. I don't know mathematically what are the chances of this, or what it means. But during these few days in Portland, I've never been afraid. And I was astonished by the high spirits of you citizens of Portland in face of this really disastrous and relentless rain. Now, I have been working away at the frontiers of the mathematics of chaos for 35 years. And during that time, there occurred a very brief wave of popularity about 10 years ago. During that time, a lot of journalists called me up and asked me questions I couldn't answer about the popular aspects of the chaos concept, the history, the origin, and its pressing thing. Why, at this time in history, would this new concept come along, and what does it mean? Well, as a technician working on the frontier of the subject, I had no idea how to answer these questions. And I was drawn against my will into the history of mathematics. You know, Henry Ford said, history is bunk. And I wouldn't say that exactly represented my attitude, but it was something like that. I had never really bothered very much about history. So I was eventually swept away with a passion for the mysterious historical accidents that led to the evolution of mathematics in our time as we see it happening. And this obsession resulted, for one thing, in my book, Chaos Gaia Eros, which recounts the story as well as I knew it 2 or 3 years ago when the book went to press. And another result of my obsession with bunk was a course at the University of California at Santa Cruz, Mathematics 181, the History of Mathematics, which I was dragged into teaching several years in a row. Now, during these repetitive experiences, casting over the history of the subject, I went deeper and deeper, and I thought less and less that history was bunk, because after you get sufficiently deep into the subject, you come out the other side of all this historical data with some kind of vivid impression of ancient times, the state of mind, the culture which is more different from ours than any aboriginal culture on the planet today. And in these scholarly experiments with history, with every pass, I became more and more fascinated with Euclid. Now, this is one of those things where you pursue different things in your life, and many years later, you see how it all connects up. So I had my career with chaos, and I had some kind of historical hobby with Euclid going on during these past couple of years. For example, on my World Wide Web page, I have 2 large circles. They're like doors. There's a door marked Euclid, and then there's a door marked chaos. I never thought of them going together, really, until these past few months. So this story that I want to tell you this evening, the story of Euclid's Voyage into Chaos, is a complete new idea of mine. And it's probably premature to share it, but I'm rushing to share it with you because I think it's just so amazing. And since these ideas are really new to me, I'm not sure I can even tell the story. So you have to give me a long leash and expect some chaos, especially with the machines. Give me a clue. Do you think that this acts like a microphone itself?
No, your mic's against your jacket.
Ah, it's coming from up here. cool. See, we have to work together on this. Okay, Euclid's Voyage into Chaos, I've got three things to explain. There's Euclid, there's chaos, and then there's the connection in between. Does it sound okay to you? Because of the monitors, it sounds kind of strange to me. There's this sibilant hiss, especially in my left ear. You don't hear it? Oh, cool. Okay, step one, Euclid. I'll start with that. It's a little newer for me, but historically it's earlier, and I've learned that telling stories in historical order helps people to understand them. Well, that's my belief, but it could be the opposite of the truth, because all these stories, of course, I've figured out in the opposite of historical order. So it's like archaeology. You dig, and then you dig deeper, and you're getting the earlier layers and the earlier layers. And then when you get to the bottom, then you play it all back and fast forward as if that's how you learned it. So that's what I'm going to do. Now, Euclid. Who has an idea what Euclid means? Those years that I taught about Euclid in Math 181, I actually never mentioned the content of Euclid's books, because I just took for granted, well, that's the mathematics as we know it, we learned that in high school and so on. It was only very, very recently, about a year ago, I decided I should really look into the content. So let me tell first the story of the book, and then we'll think about the content. The book contained all the understanding of mathematics that the ancient Greeks had that you could put in a book, which we all thought was most of Greek mathematics. But recent research shows that this mathematics had mystical associations, religious associations, which couldn't actually be put into a book. So the Greeks knew about them, and we don't. So Euclid was a hard-working mathematician of Plato's academy, and his job was to record what everybody else was doing. And the record was called the elements, because these were more or less the elements that you had to know to go on with your studies of philosophy, rhetoric, and so on. And the style of Euclid's elements, quite apart from the content, the style was a new invention of the Greeks, whereas the content came to them from ancient civilizations, Sumer, Babylonia, Egypt, and so on. The style was, as far as we can tell from all historical records, some kind of new invention of the Greeks. That's this style of formal logic with definitions, postulates, common notions, theorems, constructions, proofs, and so on. They perfected this style within a very short time to the same level that we know it today. Very little has been added. And that's 2,500 years ago. So this happened, according to mathematical myth, in the time of Thales and Pythagoras, 500 BC. And Thales and Pythagoras were people, wise men, seers, prophets, who traveled all over the known world, studying with priests in temples and so on, learning, memorizing, remembering, taking notes, and carrying back to Greece the knowledge of these civilizations. And also the beliefs. Pythagoras was the founder of a mathematical religion of which Plato was a follower. So the details of this religion are pretty much lost because of the burning of the Alexandrian library and other historical accidents causing the loss of books. But furthermore, the belief of the Pythagorean religion were secret, and the penalty for revealing a secret was death. So it's very hard to find out anything about it. But recent scholarship. I mean, the study of the classics still goes on, even though there's only a small number of surviving works ever written in ancient Greek. Scholars are still finding out new things. And one of the things they're uncovering is the connection between the Pythagorean religion and the Orphic religion. They're more or less the same thing. So Euclid's Elements, as a mathematical text written in the language of formal logic, comes to us from essentially directly from the religions of ancient Egypt and Sumer and Babylonia. But not the formal logic. So somehow the novelty of formal logic in the time of Plato's Academy led, and this is a historical accident which is somehow significant for what is happening in our time, it led Euclid to write down the mathematical ideas in a language, formal logic, which makes them abundantly clear and certain, and gives the impression of truth, mathematical truth, absolute truth, that later philosophers, even up to today, to the time of Husserl, for example, in this century around 1930, talking about the mathematical facts in Euclid's Elements as the epitome of some kind of absolute truth. That at least in mathematics there's truth and it can be established with formal logic and so on. That is the impression which is the inevitable result of the style of writing of Euclid in the Elements. Now this book, Euclid's Elements, is the second most popular book of all time. The first is the Bible. The second is Euclid's Elements, which is the most important mathematical textbook of all time. It's still important and still studied. All famous mathematicians and great mathematicians of the past studied from it. What do you think is the third most published book in history? Tarzan of the Apes by Edgar Rice Burroughs. So this is, there are not very many books that have stood the test of time of 2,300 years like Euclid's Elements. And nevertheless, it seems to me, in retrospect, that this book somehow carries a lie, because although it didn't explicitly deny the religious overtones, nevertheless, it failed to carry them. So let me just tell you a couple things about the Pythagorean religion of ancient Greece. This was a religion full of gods, goddesses, angels, and stars that were alive in a celestial sphere that could think and run like creative computer programs that materialize stuff on planet Earth. And this religion was full of magic and alchemy and astrology and all what we associate with pagan religion. It was full of that, in contradistinction to the sterile feeling of Euclid's Elements with the definition, theorem, and the proof. So I don't know how that could be, that all the secret mystical stuff was forgotten, so that as Euclid's Elements traveled around the world for 2,300 years, going from Alexandria in North Egypt, where it was written, and arriving in London in the year 1570, that throughout that journey, the message was progressively more and more flattened. In each successive generation, there was less and less magic and more worship of logic, until we end up with science of today based on Aristotelian logic. Now this journey, I've got a book in progress called Euclid's Voyage, where I just tell the journey up through the Middle Ages. The book travels in a spiral. I have a map in here somewhere, I'm not sure I can find it. The book traveled in a spiral. It went from Alexandria to Byzantium to Baghdad to Cairo, Cordoba, Palermo, Rome, and so on. It went in this spiral, and every time it traveled through a culture, it appeared to trigger a major social transformation. So somehow this book has powerful magic. And you have to wonder what exactly happened when it reached our society. What happened when Euclid's Elements reached London? What was going on there in the year 1570 that brought about the publication of Euclid's Elements in English? And who was responsible? So that was a person, John Dee, a leading figure of the Northern Renaissance. And the transformation that was triggered by Euclid's Elements in arriving in Europe was the Renaissance. And John Dee, the Renaissance progressed, of course, from Italy to England. It moved fairly slowly, so it takes 100 or 200 years to go a distance like that. And when it reached London, in the hands of John Dee, who was the astrologer to Queen Elizabeth I, who designed the British Empire as a mathematical exercise, who was appointed imperial mathematicus, whatever that is, and created the British Museum Reading Room as a personal library in his own house where Renaissance scientists and humanists met and created the Royal Academy of London. So he was a very influential figure in his time, and besides translating Euclid into English, under the democratic notion that making the work available in vernacular language as opposed to Latin would have a transformative effect on society. I mean, he was doing an intentional social intervention, like environmental activists like Earth First or something, on his society. When he wasn't doing this, what he did was speak with angels. For 8 years in a row, he spoke with angels. He had a favorite angel named Medimi, who was only 2 or 3 inches tall, and ran around the bookshelves, and explained to him, she only spoke Enochian. So first of all, she had to teach John Dee Enochian. Well, I'm getting carried away here, but I'll just try to give you the feeling. My belief, this is an intuition, I can't prove this, but I believe, for John Dee, we have biographies, we have written material in his own hand, including handwriting in the British Museum. We have all these records about John Dee. We have nothing whatsoever about Pythagoras. In fact, in the span of 2,000 years, we have these two figures, which I believe are so similar that you'd almost say that John Dee is a reincarnation of Pythagoras or something. He had the magic, the astrology, the attunement with his time, the effect on leading the, it was very similar. So you can say you want to get a feeling for Pythagoras. Many conservative scholars, historians, classicists believe that Pythagoras never existed. They call him a mythical figure. Say, well, I think Pythagoras existed, and if you want to know what he was like, you can just read a biography of John Dee. See, he's very interesting. Not only he's very interesting, but his time. Queen Elizabeth I, her costumes, her concepts, everything is so similar to the hippies of the 1960s. You say, well, this, it seems familiar. And also that revolutionary time came abruptly to an end, turning into rather its opposite, as did the hip culture of the 1960s. So in this way, we get a feeling for the magic that is associated secretly with Euclid's Elements, and somehow this magic decreased as it traveled along, but must somehow be implicit in the book, because if somebody held the book, then they became like John Dee, start talking to angels, or a spiritual transformation might take place. Now, through all the writing that I had done about Euclid's Elements, figuring out stuff like I just told you, I'm sorry to confess that I had never actually held the thing in my hand. Somebody had given me a copy of part of it. I know it was on my shelf somewhere, but I didn't get to that until about a year ago. And I don't know, I I can't remember how this happened. I don't know how this happened. I picked up and I looked. And it finally occurred to me that I was just not doing it. I didn't touch the book. I hadn't participated. If there was a Euclidean process that turns a person into John Dee, I hadn't risked it. Was this an avoidance reaction or what? So about a year ago, shortly before Christmas, I picked it up and I said, I'm going to try to make sense out of the first page. You know, like, let me see a page of this thing. And you pick up the book. It's 3 volumes, paperback reproduction from Dover of the translation, the definitive translation into English, which is the 3rd really important one. The first with John Dee, the second with Dr. Robert Simpson in 1781, and the 3rd of Sir Thomas L. Heath in 1908. So I have the 1908 edition in a cheap paperback reproduction. And the author of this translation, the translator, fantastic scholar of the history of that book, is like hundreds of pages in the beginning, which is the commentary by him about the history of the book, the religion of the Pythagoreans, fascinating stuff before you actually get to the first page of Euclid. And then you see, let me try to show you this. Well, I'll say what happened after that is I began a process of translating Euclid's elements into pictures, which I call the VEE, the visual elements of Euclid. And I've been working on that every morning. I've become captured by this strange missionary project. Every morning, my day starts early. I spend an hour translating Euclid's elements from English, formal mathematical Aristotelian logic, symbols without pictures, into a sequence of pictures that anybody could understand as a kind of an animated, you know, because what is in there are lines, triangles, and circles in motion. And the motion is described in the arcane mathematical symbols, and each proposition, which is either a theorem or a construction, is illustrated with only a single picture. So it takes just like 2 pages, one proposition. There's 700 of them in the 3 volumes altogether. One proposition, 4 pages of arcane symbols, and 1 picture. So I've changed the 1 picture into 20, 30, 40 pictures that go the step-by-step, so you could, in principle, let me just show you one, if I can make this go. Now you're going to this is proposition 1 of book 1. There are 13 books as Euclid divided the text. And it happens to be a construction. Now, I learned in my spending an hour with Euclid every day that transformed me spiritually that out of the 700 propositions, there are 100 constructions roughly, and those are the important things. And all the logic is only to really establish that the construction does what you think it does. So the constructions are primary, and that's where the magic is contained. Now, this first proposition in Euclid is a construction that is supposed to end up with an equilateral triangle. Here it is. You see this triangle with the yellow triangle, the black lines are 3 lines of the same length, and that is supposed to be constructed when you are given in advance only the length. Given 1 side, construct 3 sides, and here's how it goes. It's dialing the number. It's contacting the host. We're using the internet here. This animation is taking place in Santa Cruz, California. And, well, you're victimized by another obsession of mine that I cannot escape, and that is the view that the World Wide Web is the most important technical innovation to come down the pike in a long time. it's conceivable that you're going to have to take my word for what happens here. I told you, you have to give me a long leash and expect chaos, because there's nothing more unreliable than an internet demonstration in a public hall. Can I leave this in your hands? Terry is going to repair this difficulty in due time, and in the meanwhile, I'll talk in the dark if you feel okay with that, or we could bring out the house lights until Terry's thumb goes up. So the content, I don't know what is the content of these books. It's been very influential. Now, one effect of entering it, I've told people, if you just hold the book in your hand and don't even open it, your brain will be rewired irrevocably. A permanent change will take place. Now, what happens if you get to the first page is, in a way, you can't put it down. And if you could grok the first page, which is what I'm trying to do with these animated diagrams, then it definitely does something to you. Now, besides my personal confession, we know that all the great mathematicians like Sir Isaac Newton, this is exactly what they did. John Dee, this is what he did. See, John Dee went to Paris, and there someone was giving lectures in French about Euclid's Elements in Latin, and then he attended and he learned and he was transformed. So it seems to have an effect individually. Is that your thumb? This working? You can do it. You're afraid you'll be polluted? Contacting host. The host gets tired in the evening. Yes. There's the line that you start with. You draw a circle from one end that goes through the other, a circle at the other end that goes through the one, and then connect the dots. It's as easy as that, but it's very difficult to get this out of the book. So my current project is to take all 100. See, well, there's a project now nearly complete to turn the book into a bigger book full of drawings, but I also want to do these animations for the 100 constructions. Now, the book has, Euclid's work has 13 books, and it's well known that they mostly deal with geometry and some deal with algebra and so on, but what they're really after, it seems to me, is to do these constructions. So you look in the first book, there's 48 propositions. Very few of them are constructions. This is one. But the second book has only 12 constructions, and all of them require all the hard stuff that's done in book one, but they seem to be the goal of book one is to make book two possible. One of the things that happens toward the end of book two, just 12 constructions. One of them is the construction of the golden rectangle. That golden proportion, which has been such an important element in Greek art, architecture, and city planning, and again during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and even in modern art. And nature is full of proportions that imitate this particular construction. And even Chop's Pyramid and older works that are almost prehistoric as far as Greek geometry is concerned, they give evidence, firm evidence of the knowledge of this construction that comes up in book two. So I'm thinking that the goal of the book was to lay a firm foundation for sacred geometry, which needed a firm foundation because it was important. It's only important if you have mathematical religion. That means that we could bring up the lights now. That little minute, that was it. The lights, the house lights. Anybody there? What is the sign? Thank you. Sacred geometry, the idea, This is simple, but it's so alien to us. The idea of sacred geometry is the essence of Pythagorean religion, Orphism, the most important religion of ancient Greece, which of course is an important component in Christianity and Judaism and Islam. The idea is that the created world is made by a creative or creative power or force or something in a process which has kind of blueprints, and the blueprints are the object of study of mathematics and is called by Plato the mathematical sphere. So the gods live in the celestial sphere, we live in the terrestrial sphere, and in between is the mathematical sphere. And when the lights of the stars of the celestial sphere are projected through these blueprints, mathematical models which look like slides, and then things materialize in nature which have those forms. Therefore, if you want to ascend spiritually to make contact with the creator or the creative principle in the celestial sphere, you have to go back up those rays through those blueprints that are like photographic slides. And then through those blueprints, you make contact with the light of the projector, as it were. They believed like that, you see. And that's the reason that the constructions were important, and you must do them well. And this was the motive for going through all this very hard work with the symbols and the diagrams and the details of the constructions. So now we're up to Book 2. It's the constructions that are the goal of Book 1. And one of those constructions is this golden rectangle, which defines the plan of the Parthenon, Cheops Pyramid, and so many temples, Gothic cathedrals, and city plans, and so on, a sacred design. Now, again, Book 3 is a whole bunch of hard theoretical problems, culminating in Book 4, where there are a very short number of constructions, again, sacred. And the main one, the most difficult, astounding construction in Book 4 is of the pentagram. That's a 5-pointed star drawn in a circle. So here's the circle. Now you draw the 5-pointed star there where the 5 points are equally spaced. Do you think you can sit down and do that? I think that most mathematicians would have a tough time reinventing the whole of Euclid's Elements, Books 1 through 4, in order to be able to do that. It's a really difficult construction. So Euclid and those hard-working, nameless people in the Platonic Academy, where it was written over the door that you have to study geometry before you can even enter. Why? That's because sacred geometry is the plan of the divine. So much for the content and the effect and the spiritual overtones of Euclid. And now I think, ready or not, it's time for part 2, chaos theory. So chaos theory is a branch of mathematics which is part of, maybe a large part of, another branch of mathematics called dynamics. So mathematics has a few parts like geometry, algebra, topology, and dynamics. And in ancient times, these were called the quadrivium. Well, the quadrivium was 4 subjects: arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. But astronomy meant not what we mean by astronomy. Astronomy, to Plato, meant understanding the motion of the wanderers. That means the planets that were known then. And the wanderers, that's the sun, the moon, and the planets. 5 planets. Understanding those motions. That's necessary for calendrics, for setting festivals, doing planting on time, and so on. That's what was meant by astronomy then, and now I guess we'd call it the mechanics of the solar system. So dynamics, if I can call it dynamics instead of astronomy, that existed in ancient times in Greece, and through the Middle Ages people were working, but when you get to the time of Newton, or Copernicus, Kepler, Newton, then a massive expansion of mathematics took place in which the capacity to model the solar system was greatly increased. to make mathematical models for the solar system. That was greatly increased. Now, what is more divine from the Platonic perspective than understanding the mechanics of the solar system? Because in Pythagorean religion, those wanderers were alive, like our Earth is alive, and they were alive with intelligence superior to ours. So dynamics, as a branch of mathematics as we know it today, begins with Newton. So we've got about 300 years of this. And the part of that mathematical subject dynamics, which we now call chaos theory, began with Poincaré around the year 1890. So do you know this story, which I think has been told a few times recently in various books, that this is touching upon the significance of Euclid's elements in our time. So because it was thought, that what Plato thought, Plato told the mathematicians working in his academy, you go to your room and you come back to me with a model for the solar system based on, you guessed it, Euclid's elements. Lines, triangles, circles. That's what he wanted. And Kepler almost succeeded in this, but actually nobody succeeded for a long time. So Newton tried and failed. Newton believed that the reason the wanderers kept going around on time was that God, he was a Christian, a devout Christian, that God put them back on track once a year, New Year's Eve, put them back on track because they would otherwise wander off, because he didn't believe that the mathematical model based on his own work was really the mathematical model that had created the solar system. So it became a kind of Mount Everest in mathematics to prove the stability of the solar system as a mathematical theorem in the context of Euclid's elements. And every once in a while, somebody would claim that they had done so when, as a matter of fact, they had not. One such person was Dirichlet, a famous German mathematician in around 1850. And he announced, it was just like Fermat's last theorem, he said that he had proved that the solar system is stable using Euclid's elements, but the proof was too long to write down on the margin of this napkin, so he'd tell some other, but then he promptly died. So a friend of his, Weierstrass, who was the most famous mathematical teacher of the 19th century in Berlin, who made German mathematics famous, in fact, and so many other very important mathematicians were his students. So he had audiences this size that would come to hear his lectures in Berlin. And so Weierstrass, who carried a great deal of authority in the world of mathematics because his students were the main professors of all the universities in Europe, he said that Dirichlet said that there was a proof, but he didn't write it down before he died, and he had tried and not been able to recover it. So this became an official Mount Everest of mathematics, and the word of this, well, the problem is very important because there's always some nut around saying that the Earth is going to take a sharp left or a comet is going to strike it, and this makes people anxious. Honestly, we can understand that. I mean, another flood could come at any time. No matter it was 32 years since the last one, it could be next month. So we would like to know that the sun is going to rise tomorrow morning, even if it doesn't come out from behind the clouds. And this important problem reached the ears of King Oscar II of Sweden, who was a very enlightened and democratic humanist king, an outstanding king. And he, at the time he heard of this problem from a mathematician named Sonia Kovalevsky. Sonia Kovalevsky was a new assistant professor at the University of Stockholm that King Oscar had created because as a humanist he wanted everybody in Stockholm to be able to go to university free, and he particularly, this was in 1850, he wanted women to attend and have a university education. Therefore it would be very important to have women professors as role models. Does this sound familiar? And he found one because there weren't very many women mathematicians, And this one, Sonia Kovalevsky from Russia, was absolutely one of the best mathematicians to ever come down the pike. She's fantastic. She carried the news from her teacher Weierstrass to King Oscar II she met at a cocktail party, and King Oscar said, "This is just really cool because my 60th birthday is next year, so I'm going to announce this as a prize." And he gave a reward, announced a reward of an enormous pile of gold for the mathematician who would prove, using Euclid's elements style of reasoning, that the solar system was stable. And his birthday was in January of 1890. And that month there was a prize paper, a candidate for the competition was received from Henri Poincaré in Paris, who was another close friend of this Sonia Kovalevsky. And Poincaré's paper purported to prove that the solar system was stable, but one of the judges, Weierstrass was one of the judges found a mistake, so it was returned to him to be fixed. And he did fix it. And in the process of fixing it, first of all, he proved that the solar system is not stable. It can't be proved to be stable in that way. So it was the opposite of what he was looking for is what he found. And in attempting to clarify the situation, he invented whole new methods of doing dynamics, which is called the geometric method or the qualitative method, and also known as the method of Poincaré, and published it with his prize paper in 1891. That is the beginning of chaos theory, because in that work he foresaw all what we call chaos theory today. He understood the mathematics, and he understood the implications as far as the problems of physics are concerned, and not just the instability of the solar system. Now we know not only, by now, I mean 1990 or so, we know that the solar system is not stable, it's chaotic. We know that two solar systems are chaotic. One is the mathematical model for the solar system created by Newton. That's mathematically chaotic. And the real solar system that we look at with telescopes, that's really chaotic. So somehow the model is better than we thought it was. So that's the beginning of chaos theory. Now, chaos theory is not the same as the chaos revolution. The chaos revolution is something new. Just in these past few years, we have the chaos revolution. Now, this mathematics was sitting there totally unheeded all these years. I was working on it. We didn't call it chaos theory. We called it dynamical systems theory. And the word chaos became associated to this work only in 1975, when somebody, James York, said, "I'm going to put this word on this mathematics." And that was, I think, the beginning of the chaos revolution, because of that connection, making that connection that many mathematicians hated for various reasons. Like chaos has bad press. It's not good for you. It's, it's like demons and devils and stuff. So they didn't want it. Nevertheless, it brought upon mathematics a great wave of popularity. It came and it went, but it came and went in my lifetime, in my professional career, so I got to experience it. And part of this wave of popularity was the publication of a single book called Chaos, The Making of a New Science, by James Glick, which was very, very popular for a year or two. And that actually carried the news of the mathematics to people in various sciences that should have known about it, but they didn't, because we weren't very good publicists, or we never thought of publishing our work in any form that ordinary people could understand. And James Glick took care of that for us. But it even carried the news of this mathematical theory of chaotic behavior from a secret clique of mathematicians to the rest of mathematicians. So it was, this wave of popularity was very important and created a kind of domino phenomenon in which one field of science after another was transformed, one at a time. First you had astronomy, because chaos in the solar system. Then you had physics, because probably because of turbulence. Some mathematicians from our arcane camp made the connection between the chaos theory, mathematical models for chaotic behavior on the one hand, and fluid dynamical turbulence on the other hand. Now, fluid dynamics is supposed to be part of physics, but fluids have turbulent behavior that physics, its favorite mathematical models, couldn't explain. So I know there might be physicists in the audience. I hope that this isn't offensive, but nevertheless, this is what I think, that physicists had trouble with the fact that fluid dynamics didn't fit into physics, and so they kind of excommunicated fluid dynamics, and it became a branch of engineering. And engineers are kind of easygoing, and they didn't mind that the mathematical model didn't fit too well. What they had to do was design the dam and the chute and so on so that the turbulence wouldn't destroy it, and they're like can-do people, and they did it. Along came the paper by the mathematician and the mathematical physicist in 1972 saying this chaos theory provides a model for this fluid dynamical turbulence, and therefore it can be orthodox. So it was revived as a branch of physics. That was so pleasing, you see, they were then able to escape from this culture of denial that had been going on for a century. So they felt good about chaos theory, and then so the astronomy and then physics was a physical chemistry, and so it went through the hard sciences getting softer and softer until finally one day arrived in the biological sciences, when there's a whole bunch of them. I mean, there's really a lot of them. There's the plant ones and the animal ones, and it attacked first. This virus first spread into medical physiology, where it was found that the heartbeat is irregular, and when the heart is severely afflicted, the heartbeat becomes regular. So the chaos in the heartbeat was actually a necessary adjunct of health, and doctors learned to measure the amount of chaos in the heartbeat and use that as an indicator of health. It should be not too regular and not too chaotic, that there is a zone on the edge of chaos, as they say, where nature feels comfortable, and that's the healthy zone. So step by step through the biological sciences, and then what? The social sciences, finally ending up with psychology, economics, and now into the arts, literary criticism. So I've seen this since 1975 or so, one field after another falling down in front of a major paradigm shift and a kind of domino effect. And maybe it's finished now, or it's almost finished. There's still some latecomers yet to undergo, like architecture. Wouldn't that be a natural? Look at all these straight lines and circles and triangles. Well, there's a few architectural movements in history, like Art Nouveau, that people like Gaudi brought in biological forms, and, well, I'm not going to publicly complain about Euclid's elements, but the fact is, there aren't that many triangles and circles in nature. We've noticed that. It's a very poor mathematical foundation for understanding nature. That's one of the little problems with it. Well, I think the time has arrived now for the promised, okay, from Euclid into chaos. Now we got like a picture of Euclid, Euclid's elements, its role in history, its content, its metaphysical overtones, and so on. And then here's this chaos theory, which is definitely a major paradigm shift in the sciences, liberalizing them in a certain way so that they are better able to model nature, especially the nature of complex systems such as the one we live in, which we must understand better if we are to survive. So chaos theory, I go around saying in my books and talks and stuff, the chaos revolution is very important. Well, there are people who doubt that. And there are people who also oppose it. Just as in the feminist revolution, there is a strong backlash movement against the chaos revolution. So that's where I'm going to try to connect them now. I had another map I wanted to show you, and let's see if I could click it up here, but I won't put it on the, well, let's see if I can find it. Are any devotees of the World Wide Web out there? No kidding. That's great. Then you'll be patient. Well, so what I'm doing that I just clicked on, and which may never arrive, is, of course, I'm planning a book about this. I find it very difficult to explain. I'm going to try now. It's just like a minute or two left to come through with the promise of this connection. And thanks, Terry. Rescue me. I want to do a book, a CD-ROM, and a website. But you know, it's actually easier to do a website than to do a book or CD-ROM. So by putting my ideas immediately in the World Wide Web, I find it the easiest way for me to collect the material for the book and the CD-ROM. But one strange thing about this is if publication on the World Wide Web is successful, then it's not clear that you actually need the book and the CD-ROM. But furthermore, the construction of a website, I mean, you could do it privately behind a firewall, but I don't have time to mess with that. So I have, 3 or 4 websites where I'm developing stuff in this way. The creative process then takes place in public, and people, by responding to the little threads that they see of the beginning stages of the creation of a work, the input then from people around the world who are watching such things happen on the World Wide Web, that actually becomes part of the creative process. So the creativity itself is transformed by the World Wide Web as a new medium of creativity. Well, I'm just discovering, it's not a theory, I'm just kind of discovering this by accident. I was lazy, I put out the outline of the book before I wrote it, and then I started getting this feedback. A lot of people were reading it, and then their feedback became part of this is what's happening. So the connection I'm looking for then is between Euclid and Poincaré in the year 1890, anticipating the 60th birthday of King Oscar II. Because after you get to that point, it's just a question of sooner or later somebody's going to read his work, get the idea. One of the main things happening that amplified the spread of this social transformation, paradigm shift, chaos revolution, was the computer revolution, the advent not only of mathematical computation, but also of computer graphics, making the results of complex mathematical models visible not only to arcane specialists of mathematical symbols, but to anybody in the public on the street who cared to look at the cover of a magazine, the pictures of the books called Fractals in Nature and so on, makes the new mathematical objects visible, recognized, and understood, fundamentally, deeply, intuitively known by anybody who cared to look. So that's a terrific amplifying factor, like the invention of the telephone or something, in the spread, the more rapid spread of the new idea, as in popular books like James Glick's Chaos, the Making of a New Science, spread from, say, the announcement of a prize for Poincaré, spread to the public, and then from the public back to other mathematicians, scientists, and so on. Anyway, the mechanics of a social transformation have been fundamentally changed by the computer, and now it's all more rapid. So I think if I could establish the connection between Euclid and Poincaré, then we could almost take the rest for granted. It was bound to happen. Now, how could Poincaré discover chaos, come up with such a different idea, radical idea, when he was rooted in the mathematics and the religion, the sterile religion of the Enlightenment that Euclid's Elements evolved into? So here is the the web page that begins the construction of this connection. This is a clickable chronograph, I call it. And here's Euclidean geometry. Of course, it starts in, well, the date of Chop's pyramid is approximately 2700 BC. But I didn't want to make the chronograph that big. So Euclidean geometry begins way up there, but it comes down here, and it undergoes an important transformation in the middle of the 18th. And non-Euclidean geometry begins. And that's all of this giant chart that I'm going to explain. Over here we have dynamics, okay? It begins, what we call mathematical dynamics begins with Newton in the year 1685. And then down here with Poincaré, it's transformed from dynamics into chaos theory, let's say. So here's the transformation. Can you see where I'm pointing? Does that work? Because I don't know what's, oh gosh, that looks quite good. Okay, so here's Aristotelian logic, formalism. There's chaos logic, a very exciting new development that resolves the problems that destroyed formalism in 1931. There are developments in philosophy also. I'm going to skip that. I just want to draw one line here that's from this bifurcation in the history of Euclidean geometry and this bifurcation in the history of dynamics. So this one is Poincaré, 1890. And here the important figures are Riemann, Lobachevsky, and most especially Gauss. Let me mainly tell you about Gauss. And from Gauss to Poincaré is just a generation or two. Now behind these, I have, behind each of these rectangles, there's cheat sheets where I have the chronology of the important things happening within that block that might arrive while I'm going to finish now in a minute or two, and my main aim here has been to provoke questions, so I'm really counting on you. I can't even start until people start asking questions. So this is just warm-up, and there'll be, you've heard these microphones, and if questions have occurred to you, please hang on to them, because in just a couple minutes I'm going to stop, and the Q&A will begin. So here is my idea of the relationship between Poincaré and Gauss. Now, so-called non-Euclidean geometry is really Euclidean geometry. I mean, it's called non-Euclidean geometry, but that's wrong. It's just a slightly refined, improved, gussied up Euclidean geometry. And what is really non-Euclidean geometry, or I would call it post-Euclidean geometry, is chaos theory and fractal geometry. That is really different. A geometric object, according to Euclid, is a line, a plane, a circle, a sphere, a square, a cube, and so on. A geometric object, according to fractal geometry, is a fern, is a sandy beach, is a cloud, is a waterfall. So fractal geometry is so much closer to nature than Euclidean geometry. See, from that perspective, we look back in history at Euclidean geometry. We say, okay, the difference between Euclidean geometry and non-Euclidean geometry is not much. So here's what happened. In the time of Euclid, he has his book. There are the postulates, the definitions, the common notions, the propositions, which are either constructions or theorems. Of the main hypotheses, the postulates, there are only 5. And everybody agreed that the first 4 were very natural. And everybody agreed that the 5th postulate, which has to do with parallel lines, is really passing weird. So even, not only, Euclid's body was cold in the grave, before people tried to prove that postulate 5 was unnecessary, because you could prove it as a theorem from the other 4. And one generation after another of mathematicians down through the ages tried to prove this, and all their proofs were faulty. So it was only in around the time 1750 or so that people began to suspect that really you couldn't prove it. And then the bulb occurred to somebody that if you couldn't prove it, then if you didn't assume it, if you put a different hypothesis in its place, you get a completely different geometry, which would be then non-Euclidean in some sense. And what that fifth postulate really has to do with is when you have a triangle, and there are three sides and there are three angles, and each angle you can measure. And when you add up the measures of the three angles, according to the fifth postulate, you should get two right angles, that is 180 degrees. So that's true in ordinary Euclidean or planar geometry. But when you do spherical geometry, that's not the case. So the first person who really made this clear was Gauss. And Gauss was not Poincaré because he was older. And Gauss lived in a time when the belief in Euclidean geometry was religious dogma. He did not dare to publish the fact that he questioned the fifth postulate. But secretly he worried. He deeply worried, and he thought, God will help. Now there's a way to tell, because if I could measure a real triangle with a real protractor and measure the three angles and add them up, then I'll know. So he tried to set out, in Basel where he lived, he set out a triangle between three churches. He carefully measured it. He went through all this gyration secretly. He didn't dare to publish. 30 years later, the Russian and the Hungarian, they dared to publish, and then it became known that there are actually three different kinds, three different flavors of Euclidean geometry that became known as the spherical, the hyperbolic, and the parabolic. And parabolic is the usual plane geometry of Euclid. So in this sequence, there is a gradual weakening of the strength of the Euclidean dogma. And I believe it's that weakness that made it possible for Poincaré to discover chaos theory. Now, this must seem a bit arcane, but I'm standing up here saying I think that it's actually important. If we could raise the lights now, it finally came up that behind each of the rectangles there's a little chronology, and that in creating a book in this way, I'm going to amplify those into text and so on. So there's the chronograph and the chronologies and the text, and all of these will be separate hypertext files that are linked together, so you can learn in a completely different way than you would from a printed book. The reason I think this is important is that I think that there is still religious dogma associated with Euclid's elements. And I don't think that Euclid's elements should go away, but somehow one has to realize that chaos theory and fractal geometry, they are sacred geometry also. They are models for nature. Now, as I said, chaos theory, which could be very important for our survival, is opposed by very authoritative people in university departments with famous titles and so on. And therefore, the whole revolution is, as it were, threatened. And I'm beginning to understand the motivation and the fear, and these are sincere people. They're not just afraid of change or something, but they are the devotees of an antique religion of Euclid's elements. And as Gauss was afraid to experiment with the idea, to reveal that he had considered the idea of non-Euclidean geometry, Poincaré was not afraid to reveal that he believed in the existence of these chaotic objects, and that he dared to think that the universe, the solar system, is really not structurally stable. So there you have it. What do you think?
Do you want to show the video at all, or? It's all queued up.
No, I think I'm going to leave that.
Skip it?
Yeah.
Okay. So start with questions for somebody.
So if somebody is thinking of a question, it's a large hall to just shout it out. So we have...
Go to the mics. You have to go to the mics.
Where are the microphones is what I'm
Yeah,
looking
they're in
for.
one in that aisle, one in that aisle, one up above.
So somebody's found that microphone.
Yes.
And here, this microphone has not been found yet.
Thank you, Dr. Abram, for coming to Portland. I've read a book one time called Thales to Kepler. I don't know if you're familiar with that book, but it takes the ancient Greeks and the Pythagoreans and kind of discusses all the mystical ideas of the Pythagorean, not all of them, some of them more related to mathematics, of the mathematical ideas of the Pythagoreans. And I was trying to think of some of the things, the magical type things that you'd mentioned of the Pythagoreans. And I kind of wrote down a few of them, and maybe if you've, being a mathematician, you would be able to elaborate on a few of these things. I was thinking of them as you were talking. One was the magical tones, the musical tones, that the Pythagoreans believed in the musical tones. The anti-planet, the anti-Cheaton, that was, they had their planetary system, and they had an anti-planet which balanced out and was behind the sun where the evil beings dwelled. The Platonic solids. I've heard the Platonic solids recently discussed quite a bit, but I've always called them the Pythagorean solids, and so it's been something that's come out quite a bit, Pythagorean solids. And there's always been those reflection state structures between the dodecahedron and the icosahedron. If you that they were interchangeable.
Well, let me just deal with these, because I think that's already more than I can handle in a minute.
Just Pythagoreans, I was just mystified by them, and so I thought maybe you could elaborate on some of these kind of ideas that were associated
Well,
with
as
the
I
Pythagorean
said,
cult.
there's an excellent and interesting new literature shedding new light on the beliefs of the Pythagoreans. And these things that you mentioned do indeed, as far as I know, represent important elements in Pythagorean belief, but that's not all. The planet behind the sun, I think, is important primarily in understanding the history of the Copernican model or something, and is not a big deal in Pythagorean history, but certainly the Platonic solids, so-called Platonic solids, are very, very important. I didn't go on with the constructions in the contents of Euclid's Elements past Book 4, but there are 13 books, and certainly you have to wonder what, after all, is constructed in Book 13. That must somehow be the culmination of the entire process of the elements. And indeed, what is constructed in Book 13 are the 5 so-called Platonic solids. Now, these Platonic solids have a prehistory that goes back way before the Pythagoreans, and the stone carvings of these 5 peculiar shapes have been found in Scotland. They're called Bethels, and they date around 1500 BC. So somehow there is a lost knowledge of ancient belief that for various reasons didn't reach us, and the interpretation of those things are pretty much beyond us. What is new in Pythagorean scholarship is the interpretation of early Western Pythagoreans such as Empedocles, who left extensive records of their beliefs, and the interpretation of those arcane records is a new and novel exercise in classical studies. Can we go on to the next question? The next
Over
person.
here to the left.
Yes. How would you explain the chaos theory to somebody who would say never heard of it in a few sentences so that they could understand it?
Well, that's a really good question, and I wish I were better prepared in terms of the my multimedia support here. Let me play this video. because what you're asking about, see, mathematics has been redefined. In Euclidean times, mathematics was about number and these circles and triangles and things. And since the computer revolution, yes. Oh yes, okay, thanks. Get it. Since the computer revolution, mathematics has been redefined as the study of space-time pattern. That means moving pattern. And so in order to understand, to answer your question, you have to experience it. You have to see the moving pattern, because we can't describe it in words, and we can't describe it in... Can I turn the volume down so I can talk over it?
You did it, yes.
Oh, thank you. So a space-time pattern, what do these words mean, is a pattern in space and time. That means the pattern in space which is moving. So moving patterns can either be very, very regular. For example, a pattern that doesn't move is a pattern that's very, very regular. A pattern that goes through a cycle of changes and returns to exactly what it was in the beginning, and then goes through that cycle again, even if it's a long movie, and it comes back that the last frame of the movie is the same as the first frame, and the movie is shown over and over again in exactly the same time. That's not chaotic. That's a simple and regular pattern. All other kind of space-time movies are chaotic by definition. And what chaos theory is about is trying to understand them.
You also mentioned that you have several websites. Is there any way I could get a hold of the addresses of those?
I can't think of anything better than to do than just to say one of them and then you write it down, okay, because I don't... So the one that I've been projecting here is called VMI, as in Visual Math Institute, VMI.vismath, VISMATH.org, O-R-G. And that's the home site of the Visual Math Institute. And it has pointers to the other ones where I'm creating these materials. And I certainly invite you to browse these. Now, this is a chaotic space-time pattern that we're seeing, and it looks very regular. But we studied this in great detail with the massively parallel supercomputer, and it never repeats. The dynamical system is made out of a true field of mathematical chaos, and when that field is left to evolve according to simple mathematical rule, it makes these patterns which are very regular, and yet they're not regular. So chaotic patterns are not unrecognizable, but there are much simpler ones, and there are textbooks of the simplest ones intended for high school, for courses in the new mathematics in high school. Chaos theory is new mathematics, so it doesn't have prerequisites, so anybody of any age could study it, and it's really simple. I can't convince you of that because it can't be done in words, but if you have a laboratory, which means a computer program that allows you to do experiments and study the simplest chaotic dynamical systems, then you'll learn all the concepts of the subject in a short time. And it's a lot of fun and it's very empowering. So you should look at Powell's On the Chaos Shelf, where there are quite a few books with diskettes in the... Are we...
Over here. I'm okay. Set up here.
Okay.
I got a call from a friend the other day. He said, "Oh, you got to go on the web and search for this paper," which I haven't done yet, but it makes sense to me, and I wanted to run it by you, that a bridge between Greek math and Pythagoreanism and so on, and fractals at least, is the golden mean. Because of the self-similarity there, it must have really impacted the Greeks who did study the ratio about how it repeats itself down, 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 up, up, up. And I was wondering if you make any use of the golden mean in your own thinking as a connection point there.
Well, I'm working on a book on it called The Golden Thread, in which I trace the golden mean from Chop's pyramid up to modern art. So I do agree with whoever wrote that paper. It's a very important subject. It's extremely revealing, and it does actually give a contact. You see, those ancient Greeks, we can't know them personally. We can't dig up their secret books which didn't survive. But through mathematics, we can know them, and that's a very important connection. They were definitely aware of infinite recursion processes that are at the basis of fractal geometry.
Professor Abraham, my question has to do with the history of mathematics. Boy, those are some neat graphics. I'm sorry to interrupt my question just to look at them.
Don't be disturbed.
The short list you have given us of the development of mathematics, that is to say there is Euclid, and then there is Gauss, and then there is Poincaré, and that's it, does seem to me to oversimplify the development. You have mentioned Newton, and you would have to agree that the differential calculus does add a new element somehow. And then there was Galois, who gave us the fact that the quintic cannot be solved using classical methods. There are the people in the 19th century who proved that you can't, with a compass and a straight edge, even duplicate the cube. And there are the developments of relativity and quantum mechanics in our own century, which are mathematically fairly sophisticated. Not to mention from Galois, of course, you got these larger and more complicated algebraic numbers. I suggest, therefore, that your putting of it in terms of chaos is the result of a greater generalization, or a greater development from Euclid, is so simple and so...
Well, I think I've got the gist of your
Yeah.
question, so
I'd
can
like
I
to hear
begin
your
an
comment.
answer? I didn't intend or pretend, and I hope I haven't given the misunderstanding that I've said anything about the whole of mathematical history here. That wasn't my intent. And my little chart, the so-called clickable chronograph, intended only to extract a few items from the history of mathematics which show a trail from Euclid to chaos. I'm only trying to suggest a connection from Euclid to chaos, because Euclid is obviously an antithesis of chaos and is resistant. And the fact that chaos could develop out of it is somehow surprising and interesting. There are many other interesting developments in the history of mathematics, and of course the many books on the history of mathematics are full of them, and I didn't mean to slight those things. I said nothing whatsoever about set theory, topology. There's so many branches of mathematics that I think are very important and interesting.
Hi. Thank you, by the way. My question is this: being very well drenched in Euclidean geometry and the postulates and deductive reasoning and the whole thing, does chaos theory have its own set of postulates, and can you deduct, do you see what I'm trying to say?
Yes, yeah, this is an
there a
excellent
set
question.
theory?
And so the question is chaos theory a theory like Euclidean geometry is a theory? And it didn't seem to be. It doesn't seem to be. But as you say, you're drenched in Euclidean geometry. Well, few people are, but everybody is pretty much drenched in formal logic, that we believe that science should deduce things and prove things, and experiments should be reproducible, and so on. Now, not only chaos theory is not like that, but I want you to know that Euclidean geometry is not like that either, because Euclidean geometry led into formal logic, and formal logic was announced as a formal program only in the year 1900. At the turn of the century, David Hilbert stood up at the International Congress of Mathematicians. He mapped out this program, which is the culmination of Euclidean geometry in being the firm foundation for all of the sciences and mathematics. But in exactly 30 years, that dream was destroyed by Gödel, who essentially said that the liar's paradox says, all Cretans are liars. I am a Cretan, therefore I am a liar. that this is an example of an unprovable proposition. It totally destroyed Hilbert's dream of a formalist mathematics. Many mathematicians choose to deny that because it's extremely uncomfortable unless you have some kind of substitute religion in mind that you can suddenly convert to. So chaos theory, first of all, didn't pretend to be like that, but the main difference is that Euclidean geometry is 5,000 years old, and chaos theory is 25 years old. So, I mean, as a new branch of mathematics, it cannot have a formal foundation because it is in the process of discovery. Even the bare essential concepts are not yet emerged. We are having the great pleasure of discovering something new. So many people might dream. In fact, I personally dreamt. I thought that's what we were doing in the 1960s, and our program really fell on the rocks because chaos theory did not submit to any mathematical formulation yet, and may never. But meanwhile, it already gave us something really, really radical, and that was a tool for making mathematical models of the old-fashioned mathematics for chaotic behavior in nature. A computer program, a robot mathematician, better than any classical applied mathematician. You give it the data, it gives you a mathematical model which imitates the data quite well. So without having the formalism, it somehow did the job of so-called mathesis universalis, which means to understand mathematical objects in nature through some process of grokking, some mathematical capability that we all have, without which we couldn't run through the woods without hitting our head on a tree, without any formalism. Nevertheless, it turns out that chaos theory does meet with formalism because the paradox of Gödel's theory about the liar's paradox, is resolved by a new kind of formal logic called chaos logic. And here is has anybody got the patience for this kind of thing? Okay, this is as new as 3 years or something. Patrick Grimm and Gary Marr at the State University of New York. First of all, as in fuzzy logic, you've heard about fuzzy logic, I know. So as in fuzzy logic, instead of truth being a 0 or a 1, we give it a range between 0 and 1. But they have a further idea beyond fuzzy logic, and that is a syllogism or a statement of formal propositions is to be interpreted as a function, that you can't even do it, whatever is a program. You're supposed to do something. Whatever it is you're supposed to do, you can't do without first having some kind of a guess as to the truth, the value between 0 and 1, the truth of the certain things which are the inputs there. Like with the liar's paradox, okay, all Cretans are liars, I'm a Cretan. Right away you say, well, he's a Cretan, so he's a liar, so, well, gosh, there's two different things he could be lying about. He could be lying when he says that all Cretans are liars, because maybe there's a few Cretans that tell the truth, or he could be lying when he says he's a Cretan and he's not a Cretan, he's an Athenian. So you have to make some assumption before you can even proceed. So Grimm and Marr said, okay, the propositional calculus gives functions where hypotheses go in that are truth values, that are numbers between 0 and 1, and then conclusions come out which were the truth values. And those are perhaps, if you're lucky, improved assumptions for going in, and then you do it again and again. And they show that with the liar's paradox, interpreted that way, when you do it again and again, it is the logistic function, the world's best known chaotic dynamical system. So the truth values never converge. However, the paradox is removed because now we have a formal logic in which that paradox doesn't occur. Now, there still might be some serious problems with it, but who could believe that after the destruction of formal logic had given birth to chaos theory, that chaos theory could give us back a better formal logic? Isn't that weird beyond belief?
Greetings. I'd like to thank you for coming and say I enjoyed this very much. I need to preface that because I'm going to be playing devil's advocate. You ended your talk by saying that chaos is also a sacred math because it describes nature. And I would gather that there are some people that might find that blasphemous, that mankind could just come up with a math which believes that it could describe the perfection of nature. I assume that discussion's been had, and there is a talk about the relationship between chaos and nature. Could you talk about that?
Well, yes, this is good. Again, in my enthusiasm, maybe I make unintentional misunderstandings. I say that chaos is the language of nature. I say that chaos theory gives us better models for nature than we had before. I don't mean to suggest that any mathematical model has anywhere near the richness of nature, nor would we want it to, because the idea of mathematical models is to be somewhere between the complexity of nature on the one hand and the maximum complexity that we can understand on the other hand, which is not much, somewhere in between. See, it's like language, ordinary language. We talk about nature, but all we can speak doesn't in any way approach the complexity of nature. This is a really good question, because I don't think we should get into the same problem with chaos theory and the better models for nature, get in the same problem that we had before with the Euclidean geometry as models for nature, where we only saw that much of nature that fit our model. That's no good. See, that's why science is destroying nature. So we have to be very modest about mathematics, about mathematical modeling, and so on. Nevertheless, as good as sacred geometry can be, is now better because of fractal geometry and chaos theory, I think.
Hi. You've used the words religion and mathematics in the same sentence probably at least half a dozen times tonight. And that's always been an intriguing connection for me. So if you have any general comments on that, I'd love to hear them, but that's not, in fact, my question. I guess what it is, and you've touched on it several times already, but if you can give me a pithy answer, what is the Euclidean religion that I think you've described, and even described many of today's mathematicians as subscribing to the Euclidean religion, and the chaos revolution, and how does it threaten the Euclidean religion?
Yeah, that is somehow a main point. Well, the Euclidean religion is a moving target. See, that in the time of Pythagoras was something probably much richer than the religions that we know today, like Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, and so on. And the Euclidean religion of the time of Gauss in 1850 is something like very, very, very flat and restrictive that could have like an inquisition. So understanding, I mean, I couldn't define religion for you or for me or anything, but just speaking loosely, we see a progression in time, which is, say with religion or mythology or culture or something, we see a progression in time, and we've said that mathematics is a study of space-time patterns, so there must be a mathematics that applies to that decline with periodic saltatory jumps toward richness like the Renaissance, when the magic of the stars and the Chaldean oracle and the Hermetic corpus was revived. So chaos theory, with its language of bifurcations, and catastrophe theory, which is another kind of hyper-simplified chaos theory that's very useful for conceiving cognitive strategy for dealing with gradual declines and saltatory jumps and so on. These are models that could be applied to the historical process. So in my book, Chaos Gaia Eros, there's a chapter called The History of History, in which I try to give a short synopsis of the main people who have applied mathematical models to things like the evolution of religion, the history of religion.
Hi, thank you. Would you consider history chaotic because it repeats itself, but not exactly? It's just the trends that are being repeated. Does that make it chaotic, or is it linear, or what?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Is history chaotic or linear or what? So again, in this chapter, Chapter 3, The History of History, the synopses that I give of different people's mathematical models for history are all these different kinds. There's the linear progression, the progress model. Then there's the cyclic return model, where I don't really believe this, but it's said by classical scholars that the ancient Greeks believed that each day would actually be repeated after, I don't know if it's 24,000, a great year, 25,800 years or whatever it is. So those are Euclidean models for history. Those are the two, the circle and the line. So chaos theory fractal geometry ought to give us new models for history, for experience, for our relationships, for the history of Portland, for the history of the Willamette River and whatever. Does it, in fact? Has anybody talked about that? So I do have a friend, Terence McKenna, who's the first person that I know who has put forward a fractal geometry model for history. And it's very simple and very revolutionary. But history, there's this thing called the hermeneutic circle, that you see what you're prepared to see, and then you make a model of that, and then that model changes you, and then you see something different. And so your understanding, if you had a model of history that you really kind of liked, and you stuck to it like the Hindu model or something, then there's no evolution there. So we like to be in some kind of ascending spiral where our cogitation, our hobbies, our recreational reading and going to lectures like this and so on actually change the way we view history in a way that somehow enhances our life and enhances the life of the biosphere and the harmony in between and so on. So I think that liberalizing our views of history and trying again, play the movie again, the movie of all history as you understand it. Read, The History of Civilizations by Durant or whatever, and see if it's not completely different after seeing this movie that I claim changes the wiring of your brain irrevocably and forever.
So a viable model for time or history would be a spiral with fractal things coming off of it?
Yes.
Is that the gist of what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay.
Like a tree, a river.
Well, it's an interesting point that the young man has brought up, this idea, and that you responded to with the notion of a spiral. This is not a brand new concept, because certainly, it seems to me anyway, Hegel and those very much out of favor philosophers, Marx and Engels, also used a spiral.
But not a spiral with fractals. No, you're
right.
No,
not. Maybe not. But could I just ask my question?
Yeah.
I know that they're anathema probably to most people in the audience, but nevertheless, conceptually, they, to me anyway, make some interesting points, especially when we're talking about a kind of Platonic or an Aristotelian logical system where you can't have something that both is itself and its opposite at the same time. That most basic of all paradoxes. And what I'm interested in is how or does chaos theory contain within it some kind of concepts of both dialectics and models of change that are dialectical. And I know that Prigoghine's work does that, although he never acknowledges that he's using dialectical concepts, but it's right there.
Yes, well, I don't know. The spiral model for history is true. It's an old tradition with many adherents, and the dialectical model is kind of a mathematical idea in the context of history or society. I don't think that chaos theory gives any new picture about that. It's more that mathematics, especially chaos theory, gives the capability of modeling anything, really. So there is this hermeneutical process, which is itself a kind of a dialectical conversation. And maybe the proposing of a model, like say a Euclidean model is a thesis, and then you have a counter-proposal of a fractal model, and that's the antithesis. And So the hermeneutical circle is something which is fundamental to all evolutionary process. And mathematics doesn't, say you had a rule of evolution, like things always run down or something, mathematics could model that. Or if you proposed the opposite rule, then mathematics could model that. So mathematics is not the answer to everything. It's simply a cognitive strategy. Now I'm particularly talking about chaos theory as a cognitive strategy for dealing with very complex dynamical processes like these pictures. What about the fourth microphone? Do you have?
Yes. I have a couple, actually several of them have been asked. In fact, I had one that I was just going to ask myself, because actually all these have been asked, except one about Tarzan, which is not really relevant. Let me just ask a question. I know that while you were in Portland, you visited over at Franklin High School, where they're doing a lot of modeling, computer modeling with systems theory type stuff. Can you try succinctly make this an enormous connection between general systems theory and feedback and cybernetics and all that stuff? How does that fit in to chaos theory? Is that something that's, is it in the same realm? There's obviously connection there, and it's a strong connection. I just don't know how to articulate it myself.
Yeah. There's the aspect of chaos theory which empowers us to make models of very complex systems is a technicality that I didn't say anything about, and I should. And this becomes particularly visible. Again, if I were well prepared, I'd have an example of a Stella model here to show. Chaos theory is a way of modeling a certain process, and if you have a scientific environment, a natural environment that you are measuring, which you have, for the sake of discussion or description, divided the organism into organs and the connection between organs, then you could try to model each of the organs separately and then connect them up. Now, this concept becomes a real strategy as soon as you have a common type of model or an agreed modeling strategy for each of the component parts of a complex system. Then, and chaos theory provides such a strategy, then they are very easily connected together. So by dividing, for example, the population of the state of Oregon into different classes of people, then writing down the population dynamics of each class, and then connecting them up through things like migration from one class to another and so on. The division into classes might be totally arbitrary. Nobody has to believe that the model for the complex phenomenon is real in any sense. But this is a modeling strategy. You use reductionist science up to a point. That is, you divide the complex system, or whatever is the natural system you're studying, into component parts, which are arbitrary and just for temporary service in making the model. You do the reductionist science on each. You look in the literature of that reductionist science. You find a model using the chaos theory, that is, dynamical systems theory concepts for each component part. Now you connect them up again. This was the project, for example, of the Club of Rome for the world economy. After dividing into little parts, nations and industry types, for example, and getting a model for each part according to accepted dogma of mathematical economics, and then putting the parts back together into a complex model with things like import and export. Then they found a model, this is before chaos theory, which was too complex to study because it had chaotic behavior, so it was chucked out. But now we have chaos theory, so we no longer feel uptight about chaotic behavior, so that very same modeling strategy suddenly becomes useful again. So the idea of feedback loops and so on is you have input-output concept. It's just one of many modeling strategies. Here's a component, it's a nation, it has input, that's imports, has output, that's exports, and has labor force moves across national boundaries and so on, has capital, labor, and products, imports, exports. That's import-export model, and you have this gigantic matrix. It's a modeling strategy. It shouldn't be taken too seriously. But that modeling strategy is one that allows you to build a complex model for the world economy out of microscopic models for national economies. And we then end up with, thanks to chaos theory, a model for the world economy which is understandable and can be fit arbitrarily well to the data kept in this system of national accounts of all the nations according to the dictates of the United Nations. That's the idea of it. Feedback is just one concept in the input-output paradigm in which the output of a certain unit eventually is fed back into itself, and that's called feedback. So it fits. Chaos theory applied to complex systems is a fantastically powerful modeling tool, and Stella and the models being built with it by the high school students at Franklin High School epitomize this modeling strategy as a cognitive process, a way to understand complex systems. And the reason I think that chaos theory really is important is that it empowers us to understand slightly more complex systems than we could understand before the advent of chaos theory.